Hey everybody, I am ready to rate another collection, and in this video I'm going to be tackling Stephen King's behemoth 1993 collection, Nightmares and Dreamscapes. I'll give some general thoughts on the collection itself and go story by story, assigning scores to each, and then at the end an overall score to the entire collection. I'm working my way through all of the short fiction collections and ultimately will be able to rank them against each other and hopefully definitively declare which collection is the very best one that Stephen King has ever published. So this is a long collection. I have a feeling this is going to be a long video. Let's get into it. So in 1985, Stephen King published his second collection, which was Skeleton Crew. And 8 long years later, he published his third collection, Nightmares and Dreamscapes. So Nightmares and Dreamscapes was Stephen King's third collection of short fiction. He had had a couple of novella collections, including Different Seasons and 4 Past Midnight. But in 1985, he released the collection Skeleton Crew, followed up in 1993 with the collection Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which collects some novellas, but mostly short stories from mostly the late 80s and early 90s period, although there are a few pieces that dip back farther back than that. The older pieces especially could have been included in Stephen King's previous collection, Skeleton Crew, Night Shift even, but weren't for whatever reason. And to me, the overall feeling I got about Nightmares and Dreamscapes when revisiting it again was that it has sort of a haphazard clearinghouse feel to it. It's sort of the let's get every single thing that we haven't published yet that's worthy of publication, sometimes debatably, into one book and get it out on the market so we can get caught up and we can just move on from here. There is some high quality material in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, but there's also quite a bit of just kind of middle of the road mediocre material. And the sheer scope of the collection, hundreds and hundreds of pages long, is just honestly, ultimately overwhelming. I had to take breaks through my revisiting the collection just to remain fresh. So the late 80s and early 90s, the period where a lot of the material from Nightmares and Dreamscapes stems from, was a pretty problematic and troubled period for Stephen King. It was the period when he reached the absolute height or depth, depending on how you look at it, of his drug-fueled madness, when he was just a writing and publishing machine, and when he ultimately crashed and burned and was confronted by his family, kicked the habit, all of the habits, and set about the process of getting clean and learning how to write again. A lot of Nightmares and Dreamscapes, kind of like 4 Past Midnight, the novella collection from 1990 that preceded it, reminds me very much of that troubled period. And rather than being truly inspired pieces, some of the pieces come across as exercises for Stephen King to just hammer out and push through the story writing process to try to regain his inspiration and regain his footing. So I talked a bit in my previous rating videos for the collections about the challenge of rating some of these collections. Night Shift, pretty uniform. It's 20 short stories all laid out, and it's pretty easy to compare one story to the next and overall. Skeleton Crew is a little bit more challenging because it includes a couple of poems and an absolutely masterful long novella in the Mist. Well, Nightmares and Dreamscapes is even more diverse. There's nonfiction about Little League Baseball. There's a teleplay, which an actual script written for television. There's poetry. There's short pieces. There's longer pieces. Nightmares and Dreamscapes is all over the map in terms of the types of materials that are included. And that's another thing that to me gives it sort of that clearinghouse feel. My initial inclination when going through this and assigning ratings to all the pieces was to leave out the poetry and the nonfiction and the teleplay altogether because they're just so outside the norm of everything else in the collection. But like with Skeleton Crew, I decided I'm rating the collections, and if it's in the collection, I will include it in my ratings and include it in this video. Whether or not that's fair, I don't know, but it wasn't my decision to include nonfiction, to include a teleplay, to include poetry in any of these collections. So I'm going to put each piece, stack them up all against each other, and see where things end up. So anything like this is an incredibly subjective endeavor. So just in general, how I would assign scores. So a score of a 6 or a 7, that's a story that's generally well written, it's engaging, but it may strain credulity, or isn't resolved in a satisfying manner, or just isn't emotionally engaging. An 8 is a really solid story, well put together, that just maybe doesn't elevate emotionally, doesn't elevate from a craft perspective, from a structure perspective, something. Nothing really wrong with it. You could read 8s all day long and have a really good time doing it. It just doesn't linger in the memory or rise to the level of classic. And a 9 is, to me, something that's it's inspired, it's well constructed, it's engaging. And a 9 is a story that's well written, it has a good concept, it's well put together, it just lacks that kind of emotional punch that pushes it over the top. And finally, a 10, if it's a perfect 10 to me, it has to be all of the things. It has to be an inspired concept, well written, well constructed, that also makes me truly care for the characters. That's what pushes it over the top. So a score of 10, really, it hits me on a mental level as I really appreciate how it's put together, and an emotional level as I really start to care for the characters, which is no mean feat in a short fiction page count. So sometime back, Noah and I collaborated on a Nightmares and Dreamscapes first appearances video. So as I go through the stories, if it has a first appearance other than the collection, I will share that, and I might direct you back to that first appearances video where Noah shows off the actual places where these things first appeared. Some really, really interesting, unique, and rare items in that video. So the collection kicks off with a novella entitled Dolan's Cadillac. Dolan's Cadillac was initially published in multiple installments in the Castle Rock newsletter between February and June of 1985. So the classic understanding that I have of collections is that they're supposed to start with a bang, and they're supposed to end with a bang as well. So Dolan's Cadillac kicks off this behemoth, massive collection, this overwhelming collection, not necessarily with a bang, more of a muffled crack. It is well written, and it is spooky, and it is claustrophobic. There's parts of Dolan's Cadillac that really made my skin crawl, because I too am a little bit claustrophobic. However, the concept itself is so far-fetched that to me, it undermines the suspense every step of the way. I mean, the main character goes to such outrageous lengths, like literally, well, not moving heaven and earth, but literally moving earth to get everything aligned, to get all the coincidences lined up, that there's absolutely no doubt that the plot will ultimately succeed. The question is, and the suspense comes from how it will succeed and what the ramifications will be. But maybe I wasn't in the right headspace for this one, but I just found it a bit ridiculous. Well written, interesting, but just outrageous and not very believable. So unfortunately, Nightmares and Dreamscapes does not start with a bang. It starts more with a whimper, and I give Dolan's Cadillac a 6 out of 10. Next, we move on to The End of the Whole Mess, which was first published in the October 1986 issue of Umney magazine. It's a really interesting concept and story, and it's well written, legitimately suspenseful, and surprising. But in some ways, it reminded me of some of the pieces from Night Shift, where especially at the end, it just kind of feels rushed. The ending kind of overall diminishes the impact of the rest of the story. And it's the rare Stephen King anything that left me wishing it was longer. I would have enjoyed more of this story and more about the ramifications of what happens in the story. Still, it's decent. It's not terrible. It just could have been more, in my opinion. So I give The End of the Whole Mess 7 out of 10. Next up is Suffer the Little Children, which originally appeared in the February 1972 issue of Cavalier. This was, I thought, an entertaining story about the insanity that naturally comes to people after spending years and years in the presence of very small children. It reminded me a lot of Village of the Damned, and sort of this idea of childhood as a conspiracy, were all these beautiful, innocent faces that were harboring these dark secrets. And the teacher's madness and her idea of how to resolve the problem with the children is truly chilling and upsetting and disturbing and all of the things. Anytime there's violence directed toward children in a story, understandably, it's always kind of edgy and upsetting. And Suffer the Little Children definitely taps into that territory. I liked how it was not really resolved in the end. That didn't feel like a cop-out. It felt like a purposeful and very fitting choice that leaves the reader wondering about what was really going on. Suffer the Little Children is an example of a piece from Nightmares and Dreamscapes that was definitely from the era that spawned the stories that went on to be collected in Night Shift. And Suffer the Little Children would have been, I think, a fantastic addition to Night Shift. For whatever reason, it was not included. While I wouldn't consider it a classic, it was definitely entertaining enough, and I liked it. I give Suffer the Little Children 7 out of 10. Next up is The Night Flier, which was first published in the 1988 anthology Prime Evil. So The Night Flier is the first of 2 back-to-back vampire stories, and these 2 stories really represent one of the high points of the entire collection. I really enjoyed how Stephen King kind of turns our modern prejudices against us in the story. So the vampire in the story is able to do all of the things that he's able to do because nobody believes in vampires. Because, hey, this is the real world, right? And we are real modern people. We're not superstitious, and we don't believe in vampires, which is the perfect situation for vampires to exist in. The reveal of the vampire is classic. It made me laugh out loud. So the main character is in the restroom, the public restroom of an airport terminal, and he looks in the mirror because he can hear water or liquid splattering. He doesn't see anything. He looks in the mirror and he can't see the reflection in the mirror, obviously, because vampires have no reflection. But the blood that the vampire is urinating out is visible in a stream just connected to nothing, splattering into the urinal. I thought that reveal was hilarious and truly inspired. I liked The Night Flier a lot. I don't consider it classic, but it was a lot of fun, and I give it 8 out of 10. Next up is Popsy, which initially appeared in the 1987 collection Masks 2. So I mentioned earlier in the video that for a story to truly resonate as exceptional as classic to me, it really has to capture not just my mind, but also my emotions. And Popsy definitely does that. It drops us into a situation that we quickly understand or feel like we understand to be one of the most harrowing that you can imagine. And that's the situation of a child a child abductor, a kidnapper, who is hunting or searching for another child, not the first child, but another child to abduct, to basically provide to their employer, to the person who pulls their strings, to disappear into the trafficking network. That's where the story starts, and it's harrowing and it's upsetting and it's suspenseful and it's gripping and all of the things. Just my emotions were immediately ratcheted up to 10 with this story. And the dread grows in you as you live inside the abductor's head, even as you get to understand a bit more about his motivations and why he's doing what he's doing. He's not sympathetic, of course, and you're kind of just strapped in for this ride because that's what the story is, or so you think. You're in this guy's head as he is planning out his next move and his next abduction. And then Popsy has, to me, maybe it was more obvious to you, but to me, a complete twist that left me surprised and delighted. It also has, I thought, an effective ending. So it's one of the shorter pieces in the entire collection, and it's really masterful how it builds suspense and then completely undermines expectations, makes you care, surprises, leaves you kind of breathless and dizzy from how fast things shift and change, and then satisfyingly wraps it all up. It's no mean feat in such a short page count, but Stephen King does it. Obviously, if it doesn't come across, really enjoyed and appreciated Popsy, and I give it 9 out of 10. Next up is It Grows on You, which is from the fall 1973 issue of Marsh Roots. So this story, while it initially appeared in Marsh Roots, was revised multiple times before finally appearing in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. I've never read the original version from Marsh Roots, but I understand that it's noticeably different than the one in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Stephen King said that this story could serve as sort of the sequel to Needful Things, and as such, it is like heavy Castle Rock local history. Lots of names, lots of places, almost like a genealogy of this fictitious town that Stephen King so famously created and then destroyed, and created again and destroyed. And he's created and rebirthed and destroyed Castle Rock so many times. But It Grows on You dips into the local history in a way that many of the other stories have not. It has a very poetic beginning, almost too self-consciously poetic, and it does include some elements of body horror that linger in the memory, but otherwise I found It Grows on You to not be particularly memorable, which was unfortunate. I've said it before, but I know Castle Rock and Derry are like the quintessential Stephen King locations, and for my money, I've always been a Derry person as opposed to a Castle Rock person. So it just didn't resonate with me in the way that it might for others. One of the main plot thrusts of the story seems to be that there's a house that is evil, and it might be growing, and additions appear on this house seemingly at random, and that the house might be doing this itself, and it might be somehow related to the wife of the man who lives in the house, potentially is molesting children, harming children. Maybe her negative juju is infesting the house, or vice versa. One of the main failings of It Grows on You, at least to me, is that was never really fleshed out or made clear. I never did quite understand what the heck was going on with that. So one interesting note, kind of an Easter egg, maybe an obscure Easter egg, but the story is set in the 80s, and there's a clear reference to one person who lived in Castle Rock having moved to Chamberlain, and where they are now selling used cars. And if you recall, Chamberlain was the location of Carrie. And if you recall from Carrie, Chamberlain is pretty well gutted by the end of that novel, which takes place in, I think, 1979. So It Grows on You is literally the only reference that I can recall, I may be wrong, but the only reference that I can recall to Chamberlain that occurs after the events of Carrie have taken place, which implies that Chamberlain is still a functioning town of some sort even after the events of Carrie have taken place, which I thought was really interesting. And in this random story, Stephen King just kind of drops that in. Like I said, for Castle Rock fanatics, I'm sure this would rate higher, but for me, it just kind of left me a little outside, feeling a little aloof. I give It Grows on You a 5 out of 10. Next up is Chattery Teeth, which initially appeared in the fall 1992 issue of Cemetery Dance magazine. It's clear almost right out of the gate that this is the spiritual successor to the monkey from Skeleton Crew. The only difference is it's just not as good. While the monkey strained credulity and was kind of ridiculous, it was still very gripping. It was a great example of how Stephen King can spin horror out of the most mundane circumstances, but Chattery Teeth is just ridiculous. Most everyone can relate to the idea of the cymbal crashing monkeys as being somewhat creepy, but the idea of a pair, even a giant-sized pair of chattery teeth as a horror device is just too silly for its own good. The teeth also do some pretty outrageously acrobatic things, some very impressive acrobatic things, leaping through the air, hanging, suspending from things while chomping. They're also hanging, even though they don't have arms, which is dang impressive, if you ask me. Chattery Teeth is not a badly written story. It's a well-written story. It just has an outrageous concept that I simply could not get into. So I give the story overall a 5 out of 10. Next up is Dedication, which initially appeared in the 1988 anthology Night Visions 5. So the main character of this story reminded me very much of the main character in Rose Madder, Dolores Claiborne, even the main character in Gerald's Game. It's of a piece with the tough female characters in tough situations, making tough decisions to improve their situations. And I found it at least spiritually related to those other later works, and I enjoyed that aspect of it very much. While the plot is, again, quite far-fetched, the strong writing, again, overcomes the deficiencies in plot and pushes the story forward. Overall, I think the story has a few queasy moments, and it is very satisfying how the main character and her son's situations do improve, their fortunes do improve as a result of her actions. I liked the story. It just, as I moved on, it just almost immediately slipped from memory. I thought it was fine, but not a classic, which is pretty much the standard for nightmares and dreamscapes in general. So I give Dedication 6 out of 10. Next up is The Moving Finger, which initially appeared in the December 1990 issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. This is another entertaining, is it real or are they crazy? Is this all happening in their imagination story? Although, like Chattery Teeth, like some other pieces in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, it's just too outrageous and ridiculous for its own good. And I found it very hard to take seriously. It was fine. You know, again, strong writing carries the day. The idea was just as thin and silly as could possibly be. Although it is redeemed somewhat by the nice punchline ending. Overall, I give The Moving Finger 5 out of 10. Next up is Sneakers, which also first appeared in Night Visions 5. This is another not very memorable, sort of middle of the road story. It's entertaining, the writing is fine, but it's pretty far-fetched, not super engaging. It does have an interesting music industry setting, some interesting images related to the sneakers themselves, but this was just kind of the middle of kind of a long, low slog through this collection. One of the places where I had to take a break so I could regain my enthusiasm to keep going. I give Sneakers 5 out of 10. Things turn around a bit for Nightmares and Dreamscapes with the next piece, You Know They Got a Hell of a Band, which first appeared in the 1992 anthology Shock Rock, which I actually happen to have a copy of. This is what Shock Rock looks like. Very interesting. Very cool. I just found this totally randomly as an in the wild treasure hunt months and months ago. So I finally get a chance to talk about Shock Rock. There it is. Anyway, the version of the story that I experienced was the audiobook version, which was narrated by Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane and Jefferson Starship, which I thought initially was kind of a hokey, too on-the-nose choice, but she actually did a really good job. If you like audiobooks, I highly recommend checking out You Know They Got a Hell of a Band, narrated by Grace Slick, because it's a lot of fun. There's an added weight when you're listening to it to the fact that you know that she knew many of the characters in the story. I mean, these people that have passed away, Grace Slick actually knew and was friends with, and she's reading this story about these people. It just adds an interesting extra element to it that I really enjoyed. This is another example, like Popsy, of just excellent misdirection. So the story starts, and it's this couple, and they're getting lost in the woods, and deeper lost in the woods, and you think you know what the story is and where it's going, and then it completely pulls the rug out from under you about, well, I don't know, about a quarter of the way through, about a third of the way through, and becomes something completely different. And then in hindsight, you realize it becomes what it always was, but it just totally wasn't evident from the beginning where the story was actually going. I loved how it takes the basic idea of something that I think most people would find very appealing, that they would find very interesting, and to be very nostalgic and a very positive thing, and just completely turns it on its head and reveals the actual horror inherent in that scenario. I thought, They Got a Hell of a Band was a very entertaining, well put together story. It captured my imagination, didn't quite capture my emotions. It didn't rise to classic level for me, but it's one of the better pieces in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, and I give it 8 out of 10. Next up is Home Delivery, which initially appeared in 1989's anthology, The Book of the Dead. It's another main island story that reminded me initially of The Reach from Skeleton Crew, just not quite as sentimental as that piece. This is another great example of misdirection, as the story starts and you think you know what it's going to be, a domestic drama, and then it completely changes direction and introduces elements of science fiction and suspense and horror. There's a particular scene in the story that takes place in the local cemetery that is very, very compelling and very well written. This is another really good story. Nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't rise to that absolute classic level for me. So I give Home Delivery an 8 out of 10.
And now a word about our sponsor.
So this channel focuses on the core Stephen King bibliography, all of the major releases, some of the minor releases and kind of oddball things, and the limited editions of those books that have come out along the way. But did you know there's an entire world of items that Stephen King has been affiliated with over his long career, but that are outside his core bibliography? He's written introductions to books by other authors and even signed his name to some limited editions by other authors. There's even been a guitar, the Cujo guitar, that was released that had a Cujo theme and Stephen King signature. We're talking dozens of items outside the scope of what we will be talking about on this channel, or at least have plans to talk about at this time. But you can find the entire list, all this information, over at StephenKingCollector.com. Click on the tab Other Editions, and here you see the entire list of these oddball kind of off-the-wall releases. Titles with clickable links, you can click, you can go in. Thomas is building out these pages, adding the information as he gets it. Titles that don't have clickable links, the clickable links are coming. This is a work in progress. But just when you thought you knew everything there was to know about Stephen King collecting, there's the Other Editions tab. Very, very interesting stuff. I highly recommend that you go in, take a look around, check it out, and you'll be surprised, I think, by some of the things that have come out over the years. Whether you're interested in collecting these items or not, simply reading about them, learning more about them can be a lot of fun. So go on over to the Collector and check it out. Moving on to Rainy Season, which initially appeared in the spring 1989 issue of Midnight Graffiti. So it's neither here nor there, and it's definitely not a mark against the story, but the audiobook version that I listened to was narrated by Yardley Smith, who is the voice of Lisa Simpson, the immediately recognizable, highly distinctive voice of Lisa Simpson. So that adds a very peculiar element to Rainy Season when you're listening to it in audio. It's impossible not to imagine Lisa Simpson sitting cross-legged on her floor with a flashlight pointed up at her face, telling you the story. Again, it's not a mark against the story. It was just a really kind of strange way to experience the story in audiobook format. So the story does a good job building suspense, and I found the two main characters and their reactions to the warnings of the situation very relatable, very realistic. I thought the story also had some interesting things to say about how far the average person is willing to go at the expense of someone else to ensure their own health, happiness, and prosperity. There's some interesting social commentary built into Rainy Season. And then the climactic scenes in the story are intense and claustrophobic, and I thought quite scary and disturbing. And then the day after the climax, I thought the resolution to the situation was also quite amusing. It's another pretty darn good story that doesn't really rise to classic level. The entire idea is pretty far-fetched, but unlike other stories in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, Rainy Season doesn't collapse under that. It manages to push through, and it turns out pretty okay in the end. Not great, not classic, but decent, and I give it 7 out of 10. Next up is My Pretty Pony, which initially appeared in the outrageously overproduced and overpriced coffee table book of the same name from 1989. In fact, that is probably the most interesting thing about My Pretty Pony in general, is the outrageously overproduced and overdesigned and overpriced limited editions. The story itself is, again, well written, and it's poignant, but it just kind of, it percolates up. It doesn't slap you with feeling or emotion. It kind of percolates up, and then it just kind of fades away. It's ultimately forgettable. I give My Pretty Pony 5 out of 10. Next up is the previously unpublished teleplay, Sorry, Right Number. This is the only such item in a Stephen King collection to date that I'm aware of, unless I missed something. This is the script to an episode of the show Tales from the Dark Side, written by Stephen King. I tried to read the script years ago, I think maybe when I was an early teenager, and I found it hard to get into. And the last time I tried to read it, like actually read it in printed form, I again found it hard to get into. I think it's just the structure or the format of the teleplay, which, while I know that's how they're written, just kind of breaks it up and makes it hard to really get into the flow. But in the audiobook version that I listened to, it's an actual performance. As far as I know, it might be the actual like audio of the episode of Tales from the Dark Side itself. And in that format, it was very engaging and fully produced, which was really interesting and appreciated. It had a nice twist at the end that I didn't see coming, although as soon as it was revealed, it seemed very, very obvious in hindsight, like I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. In the print version, I would give this piece a 5 out of 10, but in the audiobook version, I give it an 8 out of 10. It was pretty enjoyable and incredibly unique for a Stephen King collection. Next up is The 10 O'Clock People, which is another previously unpublished piece. There were elements of this that reminded me of Insomnia. So like the main character starts to see the reality behind the reality and kind of starts to freak out and trip out a bit on that, and then has to be guided through that by other characters in the story. That made me think of Insomnia. There were some very entertaining scenes in The 10 O'Clock People when the main character realizes what's really going on and he can see reality, but for his own safety, he can't let on that he sees it. So the distinction between the way he feels and the thoughts going through his head and the words coming out of his mouth as he's trying to hold it all together are very amusing. The story has an effective climactic scene and wrap up. The whole thing, I thought, was quite visual. And while it's not explicitly stated, I couldn't help but think that the Batmen from the 10 O'Clock People may be somehow related to the Cantoi from the Dark Tower series. It's not really explicitly laid out. It was just something that occurred to me as I was listening to the story. I give the 10 O'Clock People 7 out of 10. Next up we have Crouch End, which first appeared in the 1980 anthology New Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, which, if you can't tell by that horribly pronounced title, is an anthology related to H.P. Lovecraft. So one of the things I really like about Crouch End is that it takes the kind of creaky 19th century feel of Lovecraft and brings it into the 20th century and sets it in a modern setting in London, not unlike how Stephen King brought back the vampire mythology and the vampire mythos and set it in modern day America in Salem's Lot. Crouch End does something similar with Lovecraft, just on a much smaller scale. Like with Lovecraft, King really nails the use of these inexplicable, bizarre details to create dread. Lovecraft was very much, I walked down an alley and the buildings looked strange at impossible angles, and build suspense that way. And Stephen King really taps into that in Crouch End. The story does build real suspense and dread and mystery, and it feels very, again, claustrophobic. I know I've used that word multiple times in this video, but Crouch End, this person's lost, they're off the beaten path, they can't get back to a place where other people are, they're all alone, and it's truly scary at times. I really liked it. I give Crouch End an 8 out of 10. Next up is The House on Maple Street, which was previously unpublished. As far as I know, this is the only Stephen King story that was based on a piece of artwork that he had seen that somebody else created that was originally used in another book. That's a really, really convoluted way of explaining that, and I may not even be right. But anyway, The House on Maple Street is a story based on the picture entitled The House on Maple Street from Chris Van Allsburg's The Mysteries of Harris Burdick. I really like how this story, I mean, it makes sense if it's based on a picture from a children's picture book. The story really taps into the secret and hidden world of children and very vividly depicts how children and adults may inhabit the same space, but often they're on completely separate wavelengths. The children have this whole secret hidden world that's hidden in plain sight that the adults in the story simply are not aware of. The adults are too busy with their own day-to-day concerns to see what's happening right in front of them, and in the best Stephen King tradition, they get punished for it in the end. There's good suspense, I felt, built throughout the story. As far-fetched as it is, Stephen King has said in the past that he doesn't start with a plot outline for a story or a novel. He usually starts with an image. And apparently the image from the Van Allsburg book was so powerful that Stephen King just knew he had to create a story to go around it. And he actually does that really well. And very compellingly, I felt, that leads up to the famous moment from the story when the house lifts up off the ground. The Mysteries of Harris Burdick is just that. It's all mysteries, single pane images that just beg to be further explained. And Van Allsburg, whether by design or potentially as a cop-out, he doesn't explain anything. He just gives you the images. In The House on Maple Street, Stephen King gives us the backstory that we so desperately need, and it's a lot of fun. I give this piece 8 out of 10. Next up is The Fifth Quarter, which is another one of the much older pieces in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It was initially published in the April 1972 issue of Cavalier. And so far as I know, it's the only piece of short fiction that Stephen King ever published under a pseudonym, in this case, John Swithin. It was the only appearance in print, so far as I know, of John Swithin, and it's a pretty good one. It reminded me a lot of Donald Westlake writing as Richard Stark. It's very gritty, very hard-boiled, gritty characters, gritty settings, gritty plot, hard-boiled everything, and it makes sense that it reminded me of Richard Stark because in the notes for The Fifth Quarter, Stephen King himself references Bachman or maybe George Stark, who was the alter ego of Tad Beaumont, the main character from The Dark Half, who was based on Donald Westlake and Richard Stark. I think the story would have fit in really well with Night Shift. I don't know why it was left out, other than perhaps it just wasn't considered one of the highlights of the era at that time. It definitely feels like a Bachman piece, which is, I know, a really strange thing to say because Bachman and Stephen King were always one and the same person, but it just has that more hard-edged tone that really says Bachman to me. I really liked The Fifth Quarter, and I give it 8 out of 10. Continuing on with another homage, we have The Doctor's Case, which was originally published in The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in 1987. So as the title would imply, this is another anthology of homages based on the famous character by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I wasn't aware before I reread the collection, but there's a term Sherlockiana, which is the official term for things, stories, homages, anything related, like fan fiction related to Sherlock Holmes is called Sherlockiana. And in this case, Stephen King dips his toe into this arena with really, I thought, accomplished and surprising results. It seems very out of character for Stephen King, has a completely different voice, a completely different tone than what we're used to, which I think makes the accomplishment all the more impressive. The case in the story holds together, the solution makes sense, the entire thing is a bit far-fetched, but not necessarily out of character for your typical Sherlock Holmes story. And it has a nice surprise at the end. I found this piece to be very surprising and engaging and accomplished. I liked it a lot, and I gave it 8 out of 10. Then we move on to, spoiler alert, what I consider to be the last really strong story of the collection, and that is Umney's Last Case, which was, I believe, at the time of the collection coming out, previously unpublished, but which did end up in its own teeny tiny little paperback standalone edition. And this is yet another homage, and this time to Raymond Chandler. It's a very engaging story that goes somewhere completely unexpected, while simultaneously managing to tread very, very fertile Stephen King ground, and that is of the relationship of the writer to the world they have created. This is something that Stephen King has tackled multiple times over his career, and again, it's even more impressive because he does it in a convincingly Chandler-esque voice that is very different from his normal Stephen King voice. The story along the way does kind of balloon and stretch and almost collapses under its own weight, but manages to push through and end on a satisfying note. There are some real laugh out loud, like literally LOL moments as Umney tries to adjust to life as a real person, including having to toilet train himself because I guess when he was just a character, he never went to the bathroom. But as a real person, oh boy, does he have to go to the bathroom. And there's a lot of that kind of fish out of water element to Umney's Last Case that I found very enjoyable. Ultimately, it's another entertaining but not classic story. There's nothing wrong with it. I liked it, I laughed, and I enjoyed it, but it's just not a classic to me. Even so, I gave it 8 out of 10. I think ultimately, if Umney's Last Case had been the last piece in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, the entire collection would have been much stronger overall. But instead, we kind of nosedive over the next couple pieces, and the momentum is barely redeemed by the last piece in the collection. Next up is Head Down, which was initially published in the April 16th, 1990 issue of The New Yorker. This was a tough one to rate, and one I initially considered leaving out of the video altogether, but it is in the collection, so I consider it fair game. What it is a nonfiction essay about Owen King's Little League baseball team. And I honestly don't care at all about baseball, so your mileage may vary. You may absolutely love this and find it engrossing and enthralling, kind of for the same reason I really don't like Faithful. I just don't care about baseball, and that puts me at a great disadvantage for this one. I found it to be a real slog and honestly rather indulgent, and it kind of just to me throws off the momentum of the entire ending of the collection. And I know I'm just not the right audience for this, and it's not badly written. I just really, really didn't care for it. So I give Head Down 1 out of 10. And then that segues very neatly into Brooklyn August, which initially appeared in I.O. number 10 from 1971. So this is a sentimental poem about baseball that ties in really well with Head Down. And like Head Down, your mileage will vary depending on how much you care about baseball. For me, that was not at all. And the only virtue that I found to this poem is that it is much shorter to read than Head Down. But even so, I didn't really care for it. I didn't feel like it necessarily belonged in the collection overall. It's a jarring, out of place change of tone, change of everything from what has gone before. So I give it a 1 out of 10. And then we end, finally, I told you this is a behemoth, massive collection with 24 pieces. It's by far the longest collection of Stephen King's career. By comparison, Night Shift had 20 pieces, but was overall, I think, less than half as long as Nightmares and Dreamscapes. So anyway, we end with The Beggar and the Diamond. I did find it to be an interesting end to a very, very eclectic collection. It's based on a classic folktale that I was not previously aware of. So the entire story was new to me, the entire concept was new to me, and I could be carried away by it. I didn't find the piece particularly engaging or gripping or memorable. It was fine, it was interesting enough, but ultimately in the end, I give The Beggar and the Diamond 6 out of 10. So Nightmares and Dreamscapes ultimately kind of begins and ends with a whimper. It has the feeling of kind of cleaning out the closet and just dumping everything previous to that point into a book and getting it out to market on bookstore shelves. It reflects a rough period in Stephen King's career and life. He's even described the period as him having to learn how to write again. And I think there's a lot of that in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It has lots of good stories, lots of fine stories, but precious few great ones. Later collections often have 12, maybe 14 pieces and generally have been of higher quality. You'll note, if you've been paying attention throughout, that there are no perfect tens in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Again, some pretty darn good stories, but nothing classic. No absolute perfect tens in this collection at all. The entire thing is exhaustive and exhausting to get through. Unlike Night Shift and Skeleton Crew and You Like It Darker, the previous collections that I've rated to this point, I had to step away from Nightmares and Dreamscapes, read or listen to something else for a while, and then come back to it. I simply didn't have the energy, the enthusiasm, and the collection doesn't have the momentum to just carry the reader through all the way as the previous collections that I've talked about have had. There's some interesting things that happen in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. There's those interesting stories that are homages, kind of pastiche to other authors, written in the voices of other authors, almost like to help him regain his own voice. Stephen King explored writing in the voices of others. And rather than creating his own characters, he had fun inhabiting the characters and worlds of other authors that he admires. And what's really interesting and kind of telling about the collection is that those pieces are amongst the strongest and most inspired of the entire collection. The ones where Stephen King is writing as somebody else are the best ones in the entire collection. Basically, like your favorite band releases an album and the best songs on the album are covers of other people's work. I think it's pretty telling about Nightmares and Dreamscapes in general. So in terms of score, there's 24 pieces, which 10 points per is a total of 240 possible points for Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Added up, the collection gets 154 out of a possible 240, which is an overall score of 64. If you took the nonfiction piece and the poem out, it would bring the score to 69. But again, they're in the collection, so I included them. The overall score is 64. Even at 69, it would still be the lowest rated collection of the 4 that I have talked about to this point. So while I find Nightmares and Dreamscapes ultimately problematic and both overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time, I do see that it serves an important role in kind of cleaning out the closet and pushing away the past and enabling Stephen King to move forward. As such, I would not recommend Nightmares and Dreamscapes be the place that anybody starts on their Stephen King journey. But for diehard Stephen King fans, for constant readers, there's a lot of highlights to be found within the collection's 800 plus pages. So let me know in the comments what you think about Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Have I been fair? Have I been unfair? Have you read the entire thing? Have you read all the pieces in Nightmares and Dreamscapes? If so, what's your favorite? What's your least favorite? And why? Do you absolutely love the baseball-related, Little League-related nonfiction piece? Or do you feel kind of like I do, that it's a bit of an indulgent overstretch to include it in this collection? Let me know. Special thanks, as always, to channel sponsor Thomas, and extra special thanks to you, the viewers who tune in and who share your comments and your support. I really, really appreciate it. And no matter where you are in the world, I hope you take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you later. Bye. SK First Editions now offers channel memberships. So how you can join the channel, on the homepage of the channel, there should be a join button that you can click. There's also a link in the description of every new video if you're interested. So there's 3 different tiers ranging from as low as $2 to as much as $10 a month. All levels get custom badges depending on how long you've been a member, and probably the most valuable benefit to being a member of the channel is that you get immediate access to all of my videos. So I produce my videos. Sometimes I cut it kind of close, but I try to have be well in advance, several weeks in advance of when the videos will actually go live. And so when I finish a video, I upload it to YouTube and I queue it up for general public release at a certain time. But as soon as it's uploaded, it is available to channel members. So you would get access to sometimes just 1 or 2 videos in advance, sometimes as many as 6 to 8 videos in advance before they're made available to the general public. So if you're interested, if you're curious, please feel free to ask any questions or check it out. And I appreciate your help, your support, and your consideration. Thanks. Bye.